If I start a petition to force people to stop saying alt-right, would you sign it?
Oh my God, yeah. Sign me up.
So unless you've been living under a rock, you're well aware of the January 6th assault on the Capitol by insurrectionists or rioters, white supremacists, what will we call it? But these have definitely brought the movement of white supremacy and the far-right extremists into the main stage. And so today we're going to speak with an expert on the topic, Mr. Alex Newhouse. He is our first guest from our first episode a few years ago, and he's our first returning guest. And he's an expert on right wing extremism, how they behave, how they interact online, their communications, and their funding sources, which is particularly pertinent considering we're a financial crime podcast. And so we have Alex Newhouse. He's a longtime friend and a colleague. He works at at CTEC, the Center for Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism. There he is the research lead focusing on extremism and far-right extremism and conspiracy theory.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, welcome back. We're really happy to have you back, Alex.
It's great to be back.
So I guess something I think that is very poignant to point out, we're recording on Wednesday, January 19th. I'm in the Midwest. It's 8 p.m. for me here, but tomorrow is the inauguration of the 46th president, Joseph Robin Biden Jr. But I mean, that's a big deal because based on exactly what we're going to talk about tonight, it's interesting to find out, we're looking ahead to see what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. So Alex, do you want to give us a brief explanation of what exactly you do at CTEC?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the research lead, which means that I run all research initiatives at CTEC. That means I manage teams of student researchers, I do teaching, I mentor, but a big portion of my job is also literally just monitoring what is going on across the internet. So much of extremist and terrorist activity, especially in the United States, takes place primarily on the internet and within digital spaces. And that includes things like organizing, planning, recruiting, radicalizing, and of course, fundraising. So what I'll do very often throughout the week, every week that I work is I'll have various social media platforms up on my screens. I'll be using different sort of data analysis techniques to collect and analyze data. And I'll just be keeping tabs on all of the different sort of corners of the fringe internet where the extremists and terrorists and conspiracy theorists, like the ones that we saw at the riots on January 6th, interact.
So if you've been monitoring for a lot of this stuff, did what happened on the 6th surprise you at all?
It did not. I mean, one of the most interesting sort of unique characteristics of American far-right extremism is that they're not particularly subtle. There's not a lot of sort of nuance and covert operations going on, at least in the sort of larger communities and larger movements that compose the far right. They had been talking about storming the Capitol specifically and also committing violence on January 6th since at least mid-December, when Donald Trump decided that January 6th would be a good date for him to focus on and call people out into the streets to protest. He, of course, did this because he viewed the certification of the Electoral College votes as the last gasp of his presidency and the last attempt to actually overthrow the democratically elected president-elect Joseph Biden. But what that didn't affect, what Trump's focus on January 6th did, is it consolidated support behind this idea that January 6th would be this big day of reckoning, almost like an apocalyptic break in American, sort of like the progress of the corrupt forces of evil in the myth of the far right. So it really didn't surprise me at all. They had been talking about committing violence. They had been talking about possible revolutions, civil wars, etc., fully in the open, in the thousands, on Parler, on Gab, but also on the mainstream platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube as well.
That's an interesting point between. Oh, Jules, you're on mute.
It's okay, you can go.
I was just gonna. You had mentioned Parler, and I think that's a very interesting point because as we see the shift of movement from like the more mainstream social media, Facebook and Twitter, into Parler, obviously then they're able to have much more free reign, although now Parler is facing repercussions for allowing this free reign, but it totally allowed these people to organize this insurrection or riot or whatever you call it. I'll call it an insurrection, but it allowed them to do it really without any backlash from the platform themselves. And I mean, like you also mentioned Gab, and there have been lots of social media that is aimed more at far right or just extremism in general. But Parler is one that sort of straddles between kind of those super fringe social media aspects and then the mainstream, and it sort of blurs the line between extremism and just like regular conservatism and republicanism. And how are you as a researcher able to I guess differentiate? I mean, or not necessarily you specifically as a researcher, but like, isn't that going to be an issue as a society and researchers at large who are trying to identify this type of activity, going to differentiate between the radical right-wing extremism and just conservatives who want to move to a conservative platform?
I mean, it is a huge challenge, and like you mentioned, Connor, it's, you know, Parler is unique in that it brought together both far-right extremists and mainstream conservatives. There hadn't really been an alternative site that had done that before that. Even Gab, which was probably the biggest, really didn't hit it big in the like political elite on the right. Parler did, and it did for a variety of reasons, which would be an entire episode of a podcast, you know, itself. But basically, in essence, they managed to sort of keep a lid on the like far right extremists who had been organizing there for years, while also having enough early adopters within the sort of like alt-right influencer class that they were able to bring over some of the sympathetic politicians early on, like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump Jr., and those sorts of characters. So it is hard to differentiate. And so I think what's important as a researcher and as a member of, you know, the community of people who are interested in countering extremism is not to think of it so much as like, this person is an extremist, this person isn't, but where are the threads of extremism infiltrating mainstream culture? And where are those touch points? Like, I think QAnon, for instance, is definitely a touch point between mainstream conservatism and what we would consider like far right violent extremism. Mm-hmm. And, you know, QAnon, obviously, like there are 2 representatives in Congress who support QAnon. There are plenty of people within the mainstream GOP who support various types or various parts of the QAnon, you know, milieu. And so I think it's important to understand, to have more nuance when we're talking about extremism and ideologies, so that we're able to understand, like, okay, we can call this person a mainstream member of the GOP, while also understanding that they are influenced by those threads and those currents that are dominating far right extremism as well.
Right, I see. To follow up, if you don't mind, Jules, I mean, now that the issue with Parler is that they've been, I mean, they were started to be sanctioned. They were getting messages from their hosts saying, like, you need to do something about this. You need to solve these problems. There's radicalization and extremism going on your platform, and they did, and they took some steps, and then eventually Amazon just took them off their servers, and so they're down. And so that brings up this whole idea of suppression of, you know, right-wing opinions and right-wing ideas. But content moderation is not new. Like, this is something, in particular in the last decade, and my thought goes directly to ISIS, when it wasn't right-wing Americans, when it was a foreign terrorist service, we were mad at Twitter and Facebook as a country. We couldn't get that stuff off their platform quick enough. And now that it's happening to them, they're saying you're suppressing my rights as an American. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think that is just the biggest form of hypocrisy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, literally every social media community that has ever existed has had some form of moderation, whether that's self-policing if it's small enough, or, you know, obviously content moderator teams, whether they're volunteer or paid, depending on how big the platform is. Every single one has had content moderation. And Parler was kicked off for a very definitive, concrete reason, which is that they were not policing literal direct threats. Like, you could go on Parler in the days running up to January 6th and even afterwards and find literally tens of thousands of posts calling for the execution of high-level politicians and literally saying, I'm going to go out and take matters into my own hands. Like, it was not subtle. there was no shortage of examples of terms of service violating stuff. And Apple and Google were like, legitimately, in my opinion, they said, this is completely unacceptable. You better clean this up or we will kick you off. And a week later, Parler didn't clean it up and they were kicked off. And the same thing happened with Amazon Web Services as well. So, I mean, it's like, there are plenty of examples of right-wing ecosystems that have not been kicked off because they're able to walk a line better that is more amenable to corporate moderation policies. Like even MeWe and Gab Gab was kicked off because it, housed mass shooter manifestos and stuff. But MeWe, for instance, is a far-right gathering place full of the exact same conspiracy theorists and extremists that you found on Parler, but it hasn't been kicked off because it, probably has been able to walk a line better and sort of remain under the radar. So I don't know. It seems like you said, Connor, sort of rank hypocrisy to yell about how they're stifling speech when, Parler is literally just allowing explicit and direct threats.
Right. And I suppose that narrative isn't assisted in any way because it happened kind of contemporaneously with President Trump being restricted on Twitter and even Facebook. So that probably didn't help the cause in any way.
Right.
I'd also like to add, I think there's a fundamental misinterpretation of what exactly freedom of speech is and isn't, because most people will say, oh, this private entity, this private organization has, limited my speech. Freedom of speech just says that the government can't limit your speech. There's nothing in there about private organizations telling you can't use their services.
And in fact, in fact, kicking people off of a private platform is protected speech for that platform. Like Twitter has protected speech itself. It is able to exercise that speech by restricting what is occurring on its platform. Same thing with Simon & Schuster yanking Josh Hawley's book deal. It's protected speech for that company as well.
So I want to touch on something that you said earlier in the conversation. You spoke on the touch points of mainstream conservatism and extremism. One thing I've noticed as an AML professional is how many other AML professionals actually lean pretty heavily towards the right. And I don't think I realized how heavily until after the events of January 6th. And my LinkedIn pretty much blew up with people having very heated debates over right-wing extremism. What is it? Where did this word all of a sudden come from? Is that something that concerns you, that these, anti-money laundering professionals that are supposed to be the front line for preventing, extremist funding might have tendencies that lean towards supporting some of these fringe movements or fringe ideologies?
Yeah, it is definitely concerning. And I think it speaks to a larger trend in sort of not directly law enforcement, but sort of law enforcement adjacent activities. Even counterterrorism and counter extremism has a similar sort of trend within it. There are a lot of people who got into the counterterrorism space during the Iraq War, for instance, or the early days of the War on Terror, who today definitely lean right and definitely lean more in an authoritarian way. And I think the same is true, it sounds like, in the AML community, and the same is true in law enforcement and the military. And I think we are starting to realize as a society that we have to come to terms with the fact that there are significant segments of people who are in positions of power to exert, whether that's force or some sort of discipline, punishment on people who lean in this authoritarian way, who might literally support, an armed insurrection in the Capitol based on a conspiracy theory. So, there are indications that massive majorities of police officers nationwide support Donald Trump, that there were 20 plus police officers who were involved in the Capitol riot itself, literally participants. And then there were, of course, the Capitol police officers who, actually helped the rioters. So it is a definite problem in something that I think we're going to have to deal with more broadly, especially if we want to move, whether that's AML or counter extremism or counterterrorism, in a direction that's more empathetic, more willing to understand why people end up in like why someone ends up as a Smurf in a money laundering scheme, or why someone ends up as like a foot soldier in a QAnon activism demonstration. Like those people are exploited and victims of a system, even though they are also criminals. And so, you know, I think traditionally AML, CT, CVE treat those people equally with like high up leaders, or with the influencer class, or with political elite who are spreading disinformation, or, you know, with the people who are actually running illicit trafficking schemes and that sort of thing. So I think there's a need to both reckon with the authoritarianism and the right-leaning communities within these broader communities, and also move eventually towards a more empathy-driven, sympathy-driven way of addressing these issues.
How do you see in your research, based on what you I guess just said, you're using words that make me recall back to being at Middlebury and counterterrorism. I mean, even in one of the articles I read, and I think it was an article that you recorded, and they're talking about how they're taking this as like a counterterrorism, counterintelligence investigation. Does this square with domestic terrorism? Like what happened specifically at the Capitol? Like were they trying to send a message, or do they really think they were just going to go in there and turn stuff over, and it was more of a practical matter?
I think it depends. I think largely the movement was composed of people who literally thought that they were going to overthrow the government and wanted to intimidate Congress into overturning the election.
Mm-hmm.
There were a number of people within that group, a small minority, but significant number still, who viewed it as a symbolic act of like a shot across the bow, so to speak. And those are the people that I'm most concerned about these days, following January 6th. They're the revolutionaries, the accelerationists, the people who view January 6th as a massive triumph and a beginning of a larger civil race war. So yeah, I mean, it's like, I think there is a need to treat, like there's obviously a need to treat this as like as an event of insurgency or insurrection, and also a modicum of terrorism as well. I am also very skeptical of the use of state force to sort of enforce against groups like this. I think it's been used poorly and inconsistently, and I think that there's a huge need, like I just mentioned, there's a huge need to interrogate the way that we actually carry out counter-extremism, counterterrorism efforts.
So when we talk about these groups and the, I guess, even something like storming the Capitol, right? That takes money. There were buses of people that were sent to the Capitol. Where do these groups usually find their funding? Is there like a GoFundMe page for Proud Boys, or a crowdfunder for Boogaloo Boys? How does it work?
There is a, funnily enough, there's a Christian crowdfunding site that is used for the fundraising of activities for the far right. And the Washington Post found that like several $100,000 was raised in the run-up and immediate aftermath of January 6th for directly far right and conspiracy theory related activities. So, for instance, Enrique Terrio, who's the chairperson of the Proud Boys, raised a whole bunch of money for his legal fees and travel fees after he was arrested in Washington, D.C. A couple of days before the riots. So that's definitely a huge place. One of the things that I actually found in my own research was that a lot of these sort of mainstream crowdfunding sites have done a good job of demonetizing, deplatforming far-right extremists over the years. Stripe, Square, GoFundMe, Patreon, all of those sites have done a pretty solid job. It took them a little longer to get a handle on QAnon, but at least over white supremacists and far-right extremists, they kicked off a while back. So it has been, this sort of like patchwork use of fringe crowdfunding sites and cryptocurrency fundraising, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a few minutes, and then like even things like mailing in like checks and money orders and all that sort of thing. So the fact that they were able to find this Christian fundraising site and raise a ton of money on it is significant, and indicates that there are definitely still gaps in our capacity to prevent that from happening.
Do these
Right, well,
sorry.
I was just gonna say you mentioned crypto, so I was gonna go there. But if Connor
Well,
has
let
something
me jump
better
in
to
before
say,
we switch over.
yeah.
I just want to, based on what you said, I wonder if there's any concern or consideration given to an idea of the effect of deplatforming these people from these funding sites like crowdfunding, GoFundMe or Patreon, and also doing so, or even just kicking them off social media or basic non-financial social media, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is there any consideration given to the positive effect of deplatforming them and the negative effect of, by deplatforming them, further entrenching their ideology as being victimized, as being kind of being brought down upon by like the establishment, by these institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the $1 trillion question in countering extremism, which is like, how do you balance the trade-off between shutting off people's radicalization pathways or their capacity to organize large numbers of people with, of course, the flip side, which is that you shove them off into a fringe site that might be more extreme and might make them double down their views and become even more violent. I tend to lean towards towards prioritizing the former. So I prefer to shut off that touch point between the mainstream public and far right extremism, like I was talking about before. I want that shut down before anything else, because it is much easier to deal with a small number of people, even if they're stealthy, than it is to deal with, as we saw with the storming the Capitol, like tens of thousands of people who are radicalized across the country. I would, I cannot imagine a situation in which, had QAnon been deplatformed from Facebook back in 2017, that they would have grown into a movement that spanned the world and, counted among its adherents like several million people within the United States. So deplatforming, in my opinion, works, and it is a tool that is needed to be used by the mainstream platforms. Demonetization is interesting, though, because I think it does work. I think there are instances where, like, cutting off the capacity for the Traditionalist Workers' Party, for instance, to raise legal fees following Charlottesville was an awesome and very effective way of essentially making them implode from within. The problem is, if you start deplatforming and demonetizing groups that maybe shade a little bit more to the mainstream, that may not work as well, because a lot of times those groups and movements have big conservative funders. They have people who don't care about, GoFundMe or whatever. And so you might end up sparking additional grievance and additional anger, while also bringing in those shadow groups and individuals to provide more sort of independent funding to those groups.
Right. And you also push them towards methods of funding that might be a little harder to track, such as cryptocurrency. So it's
yes,
no secret
exactly.
no secret that my day job involves a lot of crypto analytics, blockchain analytics. One thing that we have noticed in recent years, and specifically recent months, are some of these popular far-right platforms, or platforms that are frequented by far-right extremists, receiving more and more funding in cryptocurrency. I guess a few questions I have about this are, what are your thoughts on it? Do you find it troubling that they're getting more and more donations in cryptocurrency? And I think the biggest question I have, not to throw a million at you, but is donating to something like Daily Stormer or Gab the same thing like donating directly to an actual far-right extremist group like Proud Boys?
I think that there is a substantive but narrow difference between someone donating to like Gab or Parler and someone donating to, say, the Adam Offen Division or the Proud Boys. And I think the answer comes down to the motives of the passive support networks who arise around extremist movements. There's a concept within terrorism and extremism studies of the passive support network. It is essentially like a force multiplier for extremists and terrorist groups, because those groups are usually very small, like, normally like maybe a dozen people, maybe 20, but they can often have a much, much, much larger online, but even in the past, sort of like public presence by virtue of the sympathetic people that they find and that they encourage to support or they encourage them to support the groups. In the past, those passive support networks were the reason why, say, like an Al-Qaeda operative was able to quit his day job and literally commit himself wholly to Al-Qaeda operations, or the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, exploited passive support networks all the time, using mail-in donations and magazine donations and that sort of thing to support them. I think that still rings true for like donations via crowdfunding campaigns on the Christian crowdfunding site to the Proud Boys. For the donations in crypto to like Parler and Gab and stuff, I think the better analog is like 20th century extremist and far-right magazines and newspapers. There's this desire to see specific viewpoints and ideologies propagated and supported. People like feeling like their views are reflected in the public. And I think the donations to platforms are an attempt to do just that, an attempt to sort of hit that, like to fulfill that desire within themselves to see these sort of clearinghouses for their viewpoints propagated and survive. So I think it's like a nuanced difference. I think like a lot of the same people donate to both groups and platforms, but it is probably an important functional difference as well.
In one of the articles I was looking at in preparation for this conversation, it was Richard Spencer said that, and this might have been years ago, I honestly don't remember, but he said Bitcoin is since we're talking about crypto, he said Bitcoin is the currency of the alt-right. And so as Bitcoin is gaining in it's gaining in value and it's gaining in legitimacy, and it's finding all these institutional investors, I wonder what your thoughts on, because Bitcoin kind of had a really bad reputation as it came out, as it was being used to fund ISIS. It was being used to fund paramilitary. It was being used to fund illicit activity. And then it started to get sort of this air of legitimacy. And then I wonder what the implications are for that with Bitcoin in terms of legitimacy among society and like vis-a-vis, more legacy or traditional institutional financial institutions. And then as well as this, if they're holding their money in Bitcoin and then Bitcoin zooms up in the last 4 months, right-wing extremists just got a lot more funding, right?
I'd like to quickly add, if you were using Bitcoin to send money to ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any other extremist group, I can and will find you.
Yeah. I mean,
there is a link.
Yeah, and that's a good that's a good point and a good sort of starting point for my answer, my feelings on Bitcoin, which is I think in like 2017, 2016, a lot of far-right provocateurs sort of drank the Kool-Aid of Bitcoin a little too hard. It had that, like you were mentioning, Connor, it had the mystique of being some sort of like criminal enterprise for a long time. And I think a lot of the public still sort of feels that way. But at this point, Bitcoin is used by like Stormfront and Richard Spencer and these various other far-right personalities basically as a fallback. Like they use it by default because they've been kicked off of everything else. It is in a lot of cases just like an alternative, like literally like a plug and play fundraising or sort of cash transfer system, because like Jules was hinting at, it is not anonymous. Like you are able to track people. It is and correct me if I'm wrong.
People think.
Yeah, exactly. Contrary to what people think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jules, but the vast majority of Bitcoin transactions still go through a very small number of companies, of exchanges.
Correct.
Yeah. So once again, you're not anonymous, and you're also still exposing your financial transactions and fundraising to the whims of a very small handful of tech companies. So, I think it's basically just used because exchanges like Coinbase and the other ones haven't caught up yet, or don't have the desire to. I don't know. I think there is the added flip side, which is like you were mentioning, Connor. There is the investment potential, which gives Bitcoin a little bit more allure just by virtue of if they hang on to it for a while, it might give them more money. But, other than that, it's basically used by default.
Although I will add, Daily Stormer, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Daily Stormer, Alex, but they stopped taking Bitcoin donations right after the election. So now they are solely doing Monero.
There you go. And that was what I was going to add is we're probably going to see a greater turn towards more anonymous, more private cryptocurrencies like Monero as we go forward. I'm guessing that the political pressure on exchanges like Coinbase are going to get pretty nuts, if they aren't already. So there's probably going to be a turn towards that. Once again, they're facing an uphill climb though, because the public and their passive support networks still don't really understand what cryptocurrency is, let alone Monero.
And regarding like fundraising, whether it be crypto or fiat currency, I mean, it's you don't fundraise to hoard funds, right? Like the idea that these people are in a fundraising sort of mindset. Does that mean that they're trying to become or have plans to become operational? I mean, we saw what happened at the Capitol. Obviously, that was an operation, but as we see them raising funds, which people donated to them, may not indicate a crime on the donor, but that it's a symbol of organization and possibly preamble into some kind of operation. Is that an accurate thought?
I think in certain cases, yeah, for sure. The problem is in the place that makes the far right messy right now is that it is so dominated by these influencers who walk the line, just toe that line. They often cross it, but they toe it really, like they deliberately toe the line between like what people would consider direct threats and direct calls to violence, and just like being a far right influencer, activist, provocateur. So like the chain analysis story was sharing that like a whole ton of Bitcoin went to Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes himself does not carry out violence, but he raises money for himself and for his organization, America First, to stage activists demonstrations across the country, to recruit people, to spread the propaganda, et cetera, all in service of this like, sort of nebulous, vaguely violent, but has enough plausible deniability that they don't get caught, and they don't run afoul of like threat financing laws and that sort of thing. So it's a weird sort of scenario that we're in right now. And I think that the next few months will be very illuminating and enlightening with the direction that the far right is going to go, whether they're going to keep this model going of having influencers running the show, or if the movements are going to take more of a violent turn, especially after Trump leaves office.
From an analytical point of view, do you see 2021 as having a lot more far-right extremist events, or I should say, when I say events, I mean like, I guess, quote unquote attacks or the like?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what Trump does. Because if Trump goes full opposition leader and starts, there was a story about him today considering creating his own political party. If that starts happening, if he starts actually organizing, like we're going to see more and more stuff like January 6th happening. Maybe not to that extent, maybe not that dramatic, but there are going to be more mass demonstrations. And especially as like America First and whatever he calls the Patriot Party and QAnon merge into some sort of like actually consolidated social movement. That all depends on what Trump does. The stuff that doesn't depend on what Trump does are the actions of like white supremacist revolutionaries, the Boogaloo Boys, for instance, like various other accelerationist groups, and then any of these sort of like QAnon Proud Boy, mainstream Trumper folk who got peeled off and lost faith in the political process as a result of that and got radicalized as a result of Trump's loss and what they saw as like the corrupt political process or whatever. In that case, I think we may see a higher risk of like one-off or sort of small scale, but very, very violent attacks. Like, for instance, the Boogaloo Boys who were planning on Molotov cocktail attacks at BLM protests who were arrested in Nevada, or the murder of a police officer by a Boogaloo Boy, or various other, like there was a plot by an Order of the Nine Angles, white supremacists last year. Those sorts of things, I think those are the things that become more common and more risky as the disillusionment with the political process grows.
So we got a long ways to go, it sounds like. I mean, 2021 is going to be a very interesting year, obviously, in determining where this sort of right-wing extremism narrative and where the actions they take go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the thing I've been saying is like when Barack Obama was elected president, there was a massive spike in militia activity. Donald Trump, who was the hero of a lot of authoritarian, right wingers, lost, and he spread a conspiracy theory and convinced, millions of people that he lost in a fraudulent manner. What's going to happen then? There's going to be a spike in extremist activity. The thing to learn will be, where does that appear? Is it going to consolidate around QAnon, or is it going to shift more towards the accelerationists?
I wonder if you have any, as an expert who researches this just every day, just this narrative that Donald Trump didn't win the election, because it's like almost an indoctrination. There's no amount of evidence for some of these people that you can present them that's going to make them change their mind. Do you have any, as an expert, do you have any idea how long? Is this going to be a couple months thing? Is this going to tone down a little bit after inauguration? Is this going to be like a permanent part of this, whether he creates his own party or this Trumpist aspect of the Republican Party? Is this going to be like a forever thing?
I hope not. But again, I think a lot of it comes down to what Trump does. If he remains a prominent face of the GOP, he's going to be able to keep this conspiracy going for a long time. He still has, 90+% of the Republican support behind him. So the Republican Party goes where Trump goes. That being said, there are some initial indications that the Republican Party broadly is trying to, show him the door and throw him to the curb. If that happens, if there's a greater rejection of Trumpism and of the conspiracy theories, and sort of like a public acceptance that Biden won, I think that'll be enough to sort of reduce the intensity of the fervor around these things. Like I said, I still think there's a small segment of people who have lost complete faith in the political system and have been activated into violence, potential violence. Those people aren't going away, but at least if Trump is repudiated, which we've been hoping for years, of course, but it'll be the easiest time for the GOP to repudiate him after Biden is inaugurated. So if we see that happen, then I think we'll at least evade the danger of a continuing and ever-growing QAnon party, patriot party.
If I start a petition to force people to stop saying alt-right, would you sign it?
Oh my God, yeah. Sign me up. I saw someone refer to the Adam. I think Wikipedia still refers to the Atomwaffen division as an alt-right group, which just drove me insane.
Do you want to, just for the listeners who aren't aware, go into why alt-right sucks?
Yeah. So alt-right was coined by a white supremacist named Richard Spencer. So already, why are we using a term came up with by a white supremacist? That's ridiculous. Second, the alt-right originally meant this new brand of suaves, coiffed, white nationalist, ethno-nationalist, conservative who used the political system to achieve their goals. So basically, it was like an electoralist, ethno-nationalist. Think like Richard Spencer, the American Identity Movement, even Nick Fuentes to a certain extent. The alt-right has essentially lost that original meaning altogether. It's essentially been used to be applied to literally any conservative movement or group that even smacks of racism, and even some that don't smack of racism, or like aren't overtly racist or ethno-nationalist. Like I've seen mainstream conservative, like the Tea Party is not an alt-right group, guys. Like, come on. And then, of course, like I mentioned, I've seen the Atomwaffen division, which is a hardcore white supremacist, totalitarian, neo-Nazi accelerationist group referred to as an alt-right group. They're not electoralist in the slightest. They want to literally nuke the government. So like it's just lost all meaning. And then it also has been, its original purpose was to launder the reputation of white supremacist and white nationalist groups. Then, after it lost all meaning, there was another attempt to rebrand by Patrick Casey of the American Identity Movement, who started calling it the dissident right, which is even less meaningful, but in some ways more truthful, because at least it was like, this is obviously a marketing stunt, and at least we can all be, in agreement about that. But yeah, the alt-right has completely lost any sort of precision in its application.
You heard it first here. Alt-right is canceled, so please stop using it.
Cancel culture coming from the alt-right, for the alt-right. The term, not, but also the movement.
Yeah, all of the above. Right. I think we are almost out of time. Connor, did you have any other questions for?
No, I think so. It's great to have you back, man. I really appreciate it. This is great insight about something that's just so, pressing these days, and it just happened. And I mean, it's just such a stressful time, like knowing that this is going on, and then just like trying to go on with our lives, understanding what's going on in Washington. And like, thank God I don't even live in Washington. I have friends who are in DC who are like, it's weird on the streets, And so definitely just like appreciate you being here to kind of clarify some of these assholes.
Yeah, it's been good being back. I love, always happy to come on Cash Only Pod.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure we'll have you on a lot more in 2021, considering the climate.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, not man, fantastic, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course. So hopefully not due to another spike or another insurrection on the government.
Seriously.
Oh shit. Well, definitely. Thanks for coming on, man. It was great to have you back. It was great to talk to you. Thanks for all the work you do. We appreciate. Hopefully, this is some insight to our listeners. That there's this cohort of people they may not think about. These like private sector and nonprofit people who are doing the Lord's work and trying to identify who the bad guys are and how they're getting funded and put a stop to it. Really,
yeah.
It's great what you guys are doing at CTEC.
And if our listeners have any comments, any ideas, any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. If you're on YouTube, if you're not on YouTube, find us on YouTube and watch our videos, as well as listening to our podcast, because we can use all the views. And yeah, I mean, if you have a whole bunch of questions, we can always do a follow-up in a month or two and see where the state of the union is at that point.
Yeah, that'd be just great. And you can check us out on social media. On Twitter is at cash_podcast. Our website is cashonlypod.com.
And our YouTube is, I don't know, just search Cash Only.
Just use YouTube. Just use the search bar. Same thing with Facebook. You guys know how to use the internet.
Yeah. Alex, do you have any shout outs before you go?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Alex B. Newhouse, and then just search for CTEC Middlebury, and you can check out all of our publications, news, etc., all the stuff that we do. Thanks for having me on, guys. It was really fun.
Of course, we will link all of your related articles on our social media and website, so you guys can check out what Alex is doing firsthand. Sorry, go ahead, Jules.
I was just going to say, how do you spell CTEC? Because I know it's not spelled the way most people might think.
CTEC, the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, man. It's been great talking to you. We really appreciate it, and I'm excited to see what happens tomorrow morning in Washington.
Yeah, you as well, guys.
Yeah, right, bye. Thank you.